It's very fine because then you have a coincidence between high solar intensity and high use of electricity, so that makes much more sense. It's just an example of how these things cannot be generalized independent of where you are. And biomass, I have mentioned already. The three others are probably, well, wave energy must be one of them. Yeah. Geothermal is probably one of them. Geothermal, it basically means that sometimes you have hot water or hot steam in the air, like Iceland or New Zealand or some places in Italy. Geothermal. Geothermal. Yeah. It's simply heat in the ground that comes from the inner core. I mean, it's normally in volcanic areas you have it because it's the same phenomenon that the heat from the core of the earth is coming close to the surface. and this is a perfect, wonderful energy source, apart from the fact that if you use it for power production and take it out, there's often some pollution associated if you don't take care of that, but that can be done. Iceland has a lot of energy. Iceland has much more energy than they can use in the form of geothermal. It's localized, so it's difficult to generalize. I would say that in this country we can do it, and to some extent in some places, not very many places with I mean, temperature is 70, 80, 90 degrees, it's fine. If it's only 40 or 50, it's lukewarm water is not very valuable in energy context. So geothermal is one, and the waves, I would say wave energy, I don't know. For the time being, I mean, wave is very strongly linked to wind. It's a wind that generates the waves, and you pick it up the same way. The only place you could really imagine wave energy in Denmark is the North Sea. That's also where you take the wind. For the time being, it seems that it pays better to build out more wind than wave. But I wouldn't exclude it. The fact is that the waves stay on longer than the wind. So one of the problems with the wind is that it comes very much up and down in peaks, and if you have other renewable sources, you can level that out, so you have less problem with storage or exchanging with neighboring countries. So there may be some potential, but I don't see that as a major source in any European country for the time being. I guess the last one is probably tidal.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, tidal is a good thing in the Severn estuary between England and Wales, because you have 8 meters of tidal water, and you have a sound which is easy to bar with. You need to build a dam or something like that. So tidal water can be a very good thing, but it's very few areas where you really have the conditions that make tidal water an attractive thing. There are some niceties, some more exotic things, that if you have a narrow sound and a big water behind, you will have a very strong current when you have tidal waters, because if there's a lot of water that has to be moved in and out. Take the lagoon at Venice, which is linked with relatively narrow passages up to the Adriatic, even though there's only half a meter, 1 meter of tidal difference in Venice. When all the water from the lagoon, or 1 meter of all that water, has to go in and out, you get a pretty strong current in the narrow inlet outlet, and then you can use that, but nobody has really seen this as an economic source of energy. So, but if you want to look for exotic things, there are many good candidates out there. But I would say that the 4 big ones to be aware of is actually hydro, bio, wind and solar.
Yeah, before we turn to non-renewable, just to recall, I mean, what is the mix between non-renewable and renewable in today's world? I mean,
globally?
Yeah.
Well, it depends a bit on how you do the calculation. Yeah. Most of the renewable, some still, particularly when I saw the latest figure, which is 5 or 8 years ago, most of the renewable was either biomass or hydropower. And actually there is in developing countries a very high use of biomass for heating and cooking and things like that. And it's not because each individual uses a lot, but because there are so many people in these countries, it actually adds up. And I think the number I believe I remember was something like 15% of the global energy consumption, which is renewable, and to put 10% of that biomass and 5% hydro. And then wind may start moving in with 1% or 2%, or solar a little bit. But that's the rough numbers. But these numbers are very far from what we are seeing as necessary if you move 20, 30, 40 years out from now. It has to grow very much.
Yeah. But if we exclude that and just focus, it's a bit silly, but if we just focus on the things we would like to have, I mean, I mean, how, is it 3% or something like that? I guess is the number.
No, well, in the EU, the objective is to double, or actually a bit more than double, I think, the share of renewables from, well, there was a bit of a problem with how they calculated in the past, but today the number says 20% by 2020, 20% renewables in our energy mix, and when this was decided in 2008 or proposed, the share was 8.5% or something like that, quite a lot of that hydro at the time. So let me put it like that, we are basically in Europe looking at putting 10 percentage point of our energy consumption from fossil fuel to renewables over a 10-year period. I mean, you can do your own numbers and say if we go on with that speed, and if we are 20% in 2020, we will be fully renewable in 2100, I mean, in 90 years from now, if we move 10 percentage point every year. But the general assumption is, and certainly in this country, that this will have to be speeded up. I have to say I had a bit of a discussion with our energy minister for the time being, because they announced a new strategy last week, which he described as a revolution of energy policy. Now it's a very funny revolution, because we have actually, from 2009 to 13, we know roughly what will be the situation in 13, because things that will work in 13 are already beyond the planning state and in the construction stage by now. So over this 4 years, we will have an annual increase of renewables by something like 2 percentage points. Over the following 6 years, from 2013 to 19, there will only be 0.5%. So 1/4 of what we have for the time being, and it's only 2019 to 20 that there's a jump of 3%. So if at all this could be called a revolution, it can only be the revolution of the 3% increase in 2019 to 20. You know, and you don't know because you haven't experienced many revolutions, but I can tell you it's very rare, it's very, very rare that a revolution is announced 6 years ahead. So we have a bit of a national debate on how to cope with this, but I can tell you for sure that we will reach our 30%, this country is going to reach 30%. We are higher than the EU average by 2020, but that's still not enough. It's not enough momentum, it's not enough speed to get out of fossil fuels by 2050. After 2020, if not more is being done before, we will have to increase the replacement of fossil fuel with renewables very significantly. So there are challenges out there.
Yeah, can we go for another 30 minutes? Would that be okay? Because we have pizzas coming in.
Yeah, 20 minutes. Let's say 20 minutes.
20 minutes?
Okay,
yeah.
Let's try that. Yeah.
20 minutes, okay. Before we go to the upper levels, just a few words about non-renewable.
Yeah.
One question is oil, peak oil,
yeah.
Everybody's talking about.
Yeah.
What is the
peak oil reflects the fact that some people say, and I would have to say today everybody fortunately agrees, that at a certain point we will see the peak oil production, the maximum production which is possible. And this, I mean, you don't have to have a PhD in either geology or mathematics to realize that, of course, with only so much oil being out there, and an increasing oil production, whether it's 1% per year or whatever is the number, at a certain point you won't be able to continue that increase, and you will have to accept a decline. And there has been much discussion about when that peak would be reached and how high it would be possible to go. For the time being, we are running into a global oil production of roughly 85 million barrels per day. It's a good number to remember, 85 million barrels per day. 5 or 6 years ago, the International Energy Agency predicted that there would be a global oil consumption in 2030 in the range of 150 to 20 million barrels per day, and they say it very courageously that it shouldn't be any major problem to provide that. It would take big investments, so it was mainly a question of providing finance, but otherwise it would be now. After President Bush got out of the US administration, the International Energy Agency never says anything which is too much against the US policy. But when Bush left, they changed radically their assessment and say now actually it is very hard to see how the world would be able to sustain an oil production of 100 million barrels per day. 20% more than the present one. And they actually made an analysis of the oil reservoirs, the oil fields which are supplying our oil today, and say we actually know these fields pretty well, and we are able to predict how much these fields can produce over the next 20 years. And what we see is that if we make the calculations and see how much will these fields with presently 85 million barrels per day produce in 20 years' time, it will be down to something like 30 million barrels per day. Don't pin me up on the precise number, but much, much less than today. There will inevitably, because an oil field gives rise to falling production. You'll see that in the North Sea, in Alaska, and many of the mature oil production areas. There will inevitably be this strong field, or this strong fall, and they said, and then they said we're not going to use 115, but maybe 100 million barrels per day, or 95 or something like this. The gap between what we need in 20 years' time and what we can expect to get from existing fields is 60 million barrels per day, or 6 times the production capacity of Saudi Arabia at the time. And that's, in my view, it's a very good way of describing it, to say that there is a very, very big challenge out there. Now, some new oil fields are being known. It is not to say that everything we know of is in full production. There's something coming up in Kazakhstan, there's something offshore in Brazil, and so on. But I think today everybody in the sector agrees that peak oil is something that is likely to happen within relatively few years, and at a level which is not very much above the present level. And the other point is that you ought to say, not everybody says that, but you ought to say that if that doesn't happen, if we actually manage to push up production more than what we see in these relatively smooth curves, what does that mean? It only means that the fall in production after we have arrived at the peak will be steeper, and therefore pose a bigger challenge, economic challenge or energy policy challenge to the world at that time. I made a calculation several years ago, simply to say, now if we assume that we have to go down from our present consumption level of these 85 million barrels per day and reduce it 2% per year, every year, go on, 2% down of current consumption, not a linear one, a sort of an exponential one, that you reduce by 2% every year. How much oil will it take to cover that residual consumption in the tailing down from our present consumption? And it'll take somewhere between 15 and 16 billion barrels. Now the proven reserves today are 1,200 billion barrels. So it would take more than the oil we know of today just to get down from our present consumption. Now, of course, the more you boost the consumption upwards, the more you use of the reserves, and the more you will need to get down to 2%. Of course, if you go down by 4% per year, you don't need that much. But on the other hand, just to try to pose to the world as such the challenge of saying, now guys, we now have from next year to use, instead of 1% more every year, 2% less. It will be a huge task, I tell you, and it will be a very strong controversy between the industrialized countries with a high consumption that will try to maintain that, and developing countries which, in my view, correctly would say, but listen, the fact that you have used all this oil doesn't mean that you have priority to the reserves. Actually, we should be entitled to our share of this. And I don't dare to think how that debate could turn out. It could be quite ugly, I would say. So I think that, in a way, rather than having a too academic discussion about when and at which level peak oil production is likely to occur, it would be more important to say that the task in front of us is not to understand this better theoretically,